Dual income household with no kids? Why don't you have one of these? Now the MG Cyberster is available globally as either a trophy or a GT, but in Malaysia we only get this, which is a range-topping GT. As a result, power on this car is heady, 510 PS and over 700 Newton meters of torque, which means that this can go from dead to 100 kilometers an hour in just 3.2 seconds onward to a top speed of 200 kilometers an hour. Charging is also very fast too. With a 77 kilowatt hour ternary lithium battery within, this car can charge from 10 to 80% in about half an hour or 30 to 80% in 20 minutes and up to 144 kilowatts DC. However, in terms of AC charging, this car only accepts 7 kilowatts, which means dead to full takes about 10 and a bit hours. Now the MG Cyberster debuted as part of the 100th anniversary of MG. That's why this car wears a plate referencing 1924 when Morris Garages was first established. And so as a 100-year birthday present, I think this is pretty good. Now while the Cyberster is an all-electric roadster, this is very much a car that references MG's very historic and very colourful past, which is why, for example, there are certain design elements on this car that call back to iconic MGs of old. For example, the lower grille on this car is designed to evoke memories of the MG GT, a car that I have very fond memories with growing up. That's also why you get these headlights, which although they look very futuristic, the main daytime running light signature is round, again very similar to what you saw from an MG GT from the 1960s, 70s and 80s, which is why this car I think is a very tasteful reproduction of what MG has always been about, and it is a beautiful return to form for this brand, although while they've won many awards for their SUVs and electric hatchbacks and so on, but this, to me, this is a quintessential MG. Now, for those of you who watch the channel, you will know that I have a deep soft spot for the Toyota GR Supra, and so I'll use that as a reference here because in terms of packaging, they are broadly similar. However, the MG Cyberster is longer and wider than a Supra with a significantly longer wheelbase, which means that this car then, as a result, has a much calmer demeanor on the road compared to the slightly more agile and sprightly Supra. Now, this car also runs on 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Pirelli P0 tires, which are suitably high performance given the high performance of this car. Now, in case it wasn't clear earlier, the Cyberster that we get in Malaysia with its 510 PS is an all-wheel drive model, which means that it is important that the front and rear tires are both capable of putting that power to the ground faithfully and, of course, keeping the 2.1 tons in check. Now, while I have said that the Cyberster is a return to form for MG, there is one feature down the side of this car that is distinctly different from any MG before it, and that is the doors. These doors are not only power operated by the key, by the button, as well as by a button inside the car, but they are also manual override should you need to. On top of that, as you can see, there is a sensor here on the side of the door and one more at the top of the door in order to ensure that it doesn't actually hit anything. Now, based on my extensive testing in 3 different shopping mall car parks, these doors don't actually take up any more space than a regular door, which means that clearance is not an issue. However, personally, I would have preferred regular doors because it feels that this car is already a bit loud, and just having the doors like that just makes it a bit of a spectacle. Now, the rear of the Cyberster is fully futuristic, which is why it cuts off very abruptly back here, and you can also see that some aerodynamic optimizations have been made. So for example, while the grills on either side are completely fake, the diffuser, however, does actually function, and it does create a little bit more downforce when you're traveling at very high speed, which is why this car can get away with just having a ducktail spoiler and not some massive clothes rack on the back. Also, because of the complex surfacing of this car, there was nowhere to put the MG badge, which is why you only have Cyberster here and MG lives up here. But that is always visible even when you have the roof up, because the roof starts from here and not from back here, despite what this black line might suggest. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think the back end of the Cyberster looks absolutely fantastic, except for 2 things. Number 1, I am not a fan of these arrows on either side. Now, I'm made to understand that the design concept behind this was to evoke images of the Union Jack or the British national flag. However, something must have gotten lost in translation, because I'm pretty sure the arrows are supposed to point the other way for that to work. That's one thing. The other thing is this button. Now this is what accesses the boot, which also makes this infinitely more practical than a Supra. However, I don't understand why this is black and not body color. Anyway, once you do pop the boot, you'll realize that this is not a powered affair. However, the space in here is not that bad. Yes, there is a huge load lip, and yes, this is not a very large opening. However, the size inside is quite considerable thanks to that soft top. On top of that, MG has actually optimized the space inside, so there are small plastic scallops at the furthest edge of the boot in order to allow this car to comfortably accommodate golf clubs, which means that, again, MG knows exactly the kind of customer they're trying to appeal to, and they have figured this car out and engineered this car in order to work best for them. Although I feel that your typical golf enthusiast may not be a fan, again, of the scissor doors. Now, the interior of the Cyberster is pretty interesting if you ask me. Now, because this is obviously a two-door, two-seat sports car, naturally life in here is a little bit on the tighter side. Don't expect the same space in here as you would in, say, a BMW 3 Series, even though it's about the same money. But instead, what they've done is created an architecture that feels very much like a cockpit. So as a driver, I feel very hemmed in thanks to the design that sort of curves around me, as well as this element here, which sort of separates the driver from the passenger, which means that the person sat in this seat, this is the business seat. Now, like I said, everything is curved towards me, which includes my two air conditioning vents, but more importantly comes my cockpit display, where I have a digital instrument cluster up ahead and I have two screens on either side that flank me. The ones on the left do things like my Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, a wired affair at the moment, as well as my navigation and phone functions. On the right is where I get all of my data in terms of consumption, charging, vehicle to load, as well as my ability to contact a dealer if I need to, as well as change various settings within the car. There's also a weather function, which I think is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Now, beyond that, there's also another screen down here which controls various other things, such as your HVAC controls, which live here permanently, or you can also use this to manipulate various settings within the car itself. And because this screen is set up in such a way that it falls very easily to hand when you're sat here, it is actually really easy to manipulate the temperature. On top of that, there are actually shortcuts where if you use, for example, two fingers, you can just immediately adjust the temperature up and down. And if you use that same gesture left and right, you can adjust the fan speed, which means that, again, it is relatively tactile. Now, your gear selectors live here. Now, I say selectors because they are separate buttons. Park and neutral are buttons, reverse and drive are toggles, which you have to pull back and hold in order to confirm the gear. Moving down beyond that, you have these three buttons, which I think control the unique selling points of this car. One on either side will do the doors, and then the one in the middle does the roof. And of course, these buttons will react very quickly, which means that if you open the door and there's suddenly something in the way, you can always stop it. Although, of course, you can also reach for this grab handle and stop the door in motion. Now, moving further back, there is somewhere for you to put, access cards or a phone. You've got a couple of deployable cup holders here which can be retracted if you don't want them to be visible, and you have a pretty decent amount of storage space down here, which also hides the USB-A and USB-C port. You get another felt-lined space down here, which is certainly large enough to hold other items. And on the doors themselves, you will actually find a little cubby hole. Now, I'm going to move this out of the way so that you can see it a bit better. So here, there's actually a covered box where you can put things and stuff. Now you can see the things I've stuffed in here. Now, the thing about this space rather, while it is felt lined, unfortunately the hinges are very obvious and they actually eat into the space in here, which means that I can't actually even put my wallet into the door. However, because it is covered, it does mean that it's not going to fall out, which means that this does function decently well, felt covered, like I mentioned, as a sunglasses holder, which is great because obviously I don't have one where I normally look for one here. Now, beyond that, we have to talk about the controls, or further controls. So obviously there is an indicator stalk here, your wiper stalk here, nice to see, and you have a bunch of tactile buttons sat right in front of you. All the buttons are very obvious in terms of their functionality. For example, these two things here move the different screens on either side, although of course they are also touch screen. You also have a multifunction toggle on the left which controls your ADAS function, a multi-function toggle on the right which controls your media function. This triggers your ADAS, so your lane keep assist, etc. And then this one, now this is interesting. So while you can control your drive modes here and your regen settings here, this is a specific mode. This is called Super Sport. Now, one thing about this car is it has a torque curve when you hit the accelerator, and so when you pin it, it doesn't immediately thrust itself forward. However, when you press Super Sport mode, it will attempt to snap your neck. Now, beyond all the practical considerations you've seen here, there's also a little bit more behind the rear seats, because there are actually two nets as well as a carpeted area back here, which is actually large enough for maybe 2 or even 3 soft bags. There's even a smaller netted area behind that if you're trying to hold on to smaller items you don't want to roll around, which means that although this is by virtue of packaging a compact sports car, the practicality in here is pretty good. Pair that with the space in the boot and I think you could get away for 2 people over a week even. Not bad. But of course, the thing about this car is, yes, it's all very nice and very pretty and nice materials and great build quality, and of course it is very fast. But of course, 0 to 100 doesn't really matter, because in an MG, it is not just about speed, it is about the purity of driving. And given the fact that this is a new generation MG underpinned by the same platform that you would have seen from the MG4, and of course, because this is their first sports car under the new ownership, the bigger question is, does this still feel like a tried and true MG to drive? Now, the thing about the Cyberster is that this is more than just a nice car. This is more than just a new product for MG. This car is a statement of intent by the new owners, SAIC, in order to show and express the fact that they have a full belief and a full respect of MG's history, and they do want to bring the brand back to form. Now, the thing about MG that a lot of people may not realize is the fact that this is not just a sports car brand, because believe it or not, long after they made the MGB GT and the MGB in general, they made lots of other cars. They made hatchbacks, they made station wagons, they made family cars, sensible vehicles that everyone could drive, and they were usually the sportier variants of a slightly more pedestrian model that would have been sold as a Rover. And so, while a lot of people may look at MG and immediately think of the MGB, which is completely understandable, the reality is that they've been a large-scale mass-market car maker for some time, or at least they had the intention to be, and now they finally are. And so, while it is important that they continue to make vehicles like the MG ZS and the MG S5 and the MG5 for that matter, vehicles like this are also important in order to understand the breadth of ability available at MG. And so, given that the Cyberster sits as sort of their halo product, this has to be the very best MG that they can make. And sat in here as I do about 70 kilometers an hour on the LDP, it does feel like a particularly nice car. It's surprisingly quiet for a vehicle that is low slung with big 20-inch wheels and, you know, frameless doors and so on. For what this car is, it is surprisingly refined. And in terms of the ride, the secondary ride that I'm experiencing now is fantastic, because while it does maintain very good body control, at no point does it feel crashy in this cabin. Even when I've gone through some particularly nasty potholes, as PJ likes to throw up from time to time, at no point has it ever unsettled me in the car, which is fantastic, which means that this MG Cyberster is a little bit more of a GT than a sports car, like I alluded to earlier. And then there is the fact that when you do decide to let the mood take you, the Cyberster doesn't fall apart either. That fantastic body control I mentioned earlier, even when the speeds start to pick up, even when the inputs start to get a little bit more aggressive, this car remains lovely and level and flat. There is a little bit of give, naturally, as you'd expect from something that is pushing over 2 tons of weight, but it feels very natural. It feels very approachable. At no point does it feel like this car's a handful, which means that, again, if you're looking for a performance car, this is a legitimate performance car. It's just not quite as sharp as what you'd get from, say, a Mazda MX-5, for example, or perhaps a used Porsche Cayman. Now, you may argue that because this car doesn't appear to be the sharpest scalpel in the toolkit, that this therefore doesn't really count as a sports car. Well, the simple fact of the matter is sports cars don't really sell very well. The MX-5, for example, one of the most popular, if not the most popular, roadster in history, it doesn't sell nearly as many cars as a CX-5, for example. The same goes for Porsche. They sell more Macans and Cayennes, and even Taycans for that matter, than Boxsters and Caymans, because that's just the nature of which people buy cars, or the way with which people buy cars. But when you package it this way and make it more approachable, more livable every day, by taking off the sharpest edge of the experience, this then becomes, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, this should therefore be the default choice for people who do not need back seats. Dual income households with no children, one of your cars could very easily be a Cyberster. Why buy a 3 Series or a Mercedes-Benz C-Class when you can have something a little bit more fun and even more efficient in town? Now that brings me on to two other factors. Number one is efficiency and the second is safety. So I'll touch on efficiency first. Now, I've been driving this car in a mixture of moods. There's been a lot of town driving, as one would expect, because I unfortunately have this car in the middle of the week because there wasn't availability over the weekend, which meant that I have had to, run my daily errands and stuff like that in this car. Now, because the Cyberster is electric first, it does mean that naturally the same requirements of an electric car are leveled at this, which means that it has to be very refined, it has to be very efficient when you're stuck in traffic, like I am now. Now, to that end, the combined figure that I've gotten over the last nearly 500 kilometers of driving is about 20.9 kilowatt hours to the 100. Now, that's not a particularly impressive figure, of course, because if you get something like an AIMAN 7, that car will do about 12. And so 20 might not seem that impressive to you. However, given the fact that this car is so explosively powerful, the fact that it can go about its business in what would arguably be the least efficient setting for a sports car, while only consuming on a home tariff about 10 ringgit per 100 kilometers, or even at a public charger you're looking at what, 30 ringgit for 100 kilometers? I'm pretty sure any GR Supra, for example, or anything with 6 cylinders would consume more than that, especially when you're driving it about in town. Now, of course, through my testing, I've also driven this car a bit more intently on open roads and at higher speeds. Now, when I do that, the consumption does climb a little bit to about 23 kilowatt hours to the 100. Now, even then, again, at a home tariff of 57 cents, you're talking about 11.5 ringgit for 100 kilometers, which is still very, very affordable. If you were to convert that to RON 95, as it stands today at 2 ringgit 5 cent a litre, you're talking about 6 litres to the 100. That's not bad. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because, again, that sort of underscores this car's daily usability, and that leads me on to safety. Now, because this is a modern car, naturally it comes with a lot of modern electronics. One of those features, or one of the suite of features, includes level 2 semi-autonomy, which means that, again, when you're just driving about this car in town, or when you're just sort of doing your business and going to work and back, the car does the majority of the work for you. That means accelerating, braking, and a little bit of evasive maneuvering should it detect obstacles and stuff like that. The way you'd expect a level 2 semi-autonomy system to work and function. And this car does all of that without fuss. Now, if you've watched any of my previous reviews of any other MGs, you will know that I have said before that MG has perhaps one of the most polished ADAS systems from any Chinese origin car maker. It doesn't get easily frightened. It actually maintains a proper, reasonable distance to the car in front, not some ridiculous bus length gap. And it never accelerates or brakes in a very harsh manner unless it has to, which means that, as far as I'm concerned, this is an ADAS system that you can trust. So overall, what does that mean for the MG Cyberster? This, to me, is a very palatable, very easy car to live with. Again, if you have 300,000 ringgit burning a hole in your pocket and you may have been sizing up a C-Class or a 3 Series, unless you really have frequent use for the back seats and it is your only car, there is no excuse for you not to look at an MG Cyberster. At about 320,000 ringgit, give or take, this is an incredibly high-value vehicle. Again, this interior is swathed in leather. There's stitching everywhere. There's a Bose audio system. It's got screens everywhere. And nothing in here squeaks, nothing in here rattles. It feels as tight as a drum. This car is built well, it looks great, and it offers true versatility for people who want a car like this to actually drive every day. So would I recommend the MG Cyberster? Absolutely. This is a fantastic sports car, a fantastic statement of intent, and more importantly, a fantastic statement of success to people who purchase or can afford a vehicle like this and can actually use it every day. However, if you're looking for a 2-seat sports car that will act primarily as a weekend toy, something that will give you all of the giggles that you want from driving thrills and nothing else, then consider the recently launched, facelifted, updated Mazda MX-5, because based on my experience from previous generation vehicles, I have no doubt that that is a much better, much sharper driving tool than the MG Cyberster. That is a car where its engineers have fussed over every gram in order never to dilute the driving experience, whereas in this, again, 2.1 tons. However, if you'd like a package like this, but don't want to deal with, for example, the complexity and the readjustment that comes with having to use an electric powertrain, then of course there is the Porsche Boxster if you want an open top, or the Porsche Cayman if you want the top down. However, those cars cost significantly more than this, or indeed an MX-5. And so if you can't quite stretch to that, then again, there is the MX-5. However, to me, the MG Cyberster is perhaps the most complete package in this very rarefied category, because this car looks good, drives well, and will surprise you with its quality and its appeal. I love this thing. Although if there was one thing I'd change, I might prefer some normal doors, just so that it doesn't poke somebody's eye out every time I stop at the mama. But in any case, that concludes our review, scarcely believably, of the MG Cyberster. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.